Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing schizophrenia and antipsychotic drugs. Okay, right, so we've now discussed the three categories of symptoms of schizophrenia. What I want to now move on to is discussing the pathogenesis of schizophrenia, or what is understood of the pathogenesis of schizophrenia. Okay, right, now, the first thing that I want to say is that schizophrenia runs in families, okay? So there is definitely a genetic component to schizophrenia. However, it is not completely determined by genes. Okay, now how do we know that it's not completely determined by genes? Well, we do what we always do. We look at monozygotic twins. Okay, now monozygotic twins are twins which are absolutely genetically identical. Okay, so they're what would more commonly be known as identical twins. Okay, right, and what we do is we go around and look for monozygotic twin pairs where one of the members of the pair has schizophrenia. Okay, and we look to see whether it's always the case that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other also has schizophrenia. So just to draw a little picture here, here's one of the twins and here's the other one. Okay, now what we do is we go around and look at loads of monozygotic twins all over the world, okay, and we find monozygotic twins where one of them has schizophrenia. Okay, so let's say that this one here has schizophrenia, and we look to see whether it's always the case that the other mono twin has schizophrenia as well, if the first twin has schizophrenia. Okay, and basically it's not always the case that the other twin will have schizophrenia if the first twin has schizophrenia. Okay, now contrast that to Huntington's disease. Okay, so Huntington's disease is a neurodegenerative disease caused most definitely by a genetic problem. Okay, in Huntington's disease, if one twin in a monozygotic twin pair has Huntington's disease, the other will get Huntington's disease as well. Even if they don't quite yet have it, they will get it at some point in their lifetime. Okay, no ifs, no buts. Okay, now, there is a fancy word for this. We call it the concordance rate. Whoops, concordance rate. Okay, we call it the monozygotic twin concordance rate. Okay, so this means what fraction of the time will the second twin also have the disease if the first twin has the disease. Now for Huntington's disease it is 100%. Okay, the second twin will get Huntington's disease if the first twin has got Huntington's disease. Okay, whereas in the case of schizophrenia, the concordance rate is actually only around 50%. Okay, so if the first twin has schizophrenia, there's only a 50% chance that the second twin will also get schizophrenia. Now that's much higher than the general population. The general population's risk to get schizophrenia is 1%. Okay, so certainly there is a genetic component here, obviously, okay, but it's not absolute. Okay, so that tells us that environmental factors and also developmental factors also play a part in determining whether you're going to get schizophrenia. It's not all determined by your genes, even though clearly your genes do play a very big part. Okay, right. So that's all I'm going to say about genetics. Now what we're going to move on to is discussing firstly a few things that are known about the cause of schizophrenia. Okay, and I'm going to discuss this before I discuss the dopamine hypothesis. Okay, so I'm going to firstly discuss a few things that you can't argue with. These are just experimental results, okay, that we know about schizophrenia, and then we'll move on to the dopamine hypothesis, and we'll see how these results that I'm about to discuss all sort of are sewed together in the dopamine hypothesis. And the dopamine hypothesis is a fantastic theory. Whether it's right or wrong, it is a fantastic theory. Okay, so let's start then with which bits of the brain are active when someone is having an auditory hallucination. So basically, what we can do is we can take a patient with schizophrenia, okay, who is having a hallucination at the moment, okay, and we can see which portions of the brain are active in an auditory hallucination. Okay, so I told you that the main hallucinations in schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations. Okay, so let's see which portions of the brain are active in an auditory hallucination. Okay, so the two portions that you see light up, okay, during an auditory hallucination are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Okay, so I'll show you exactly where these two areas of the cerebral cortex are, and then we'll also discuss what their actual function is. Okay, so firstly let's discuss where these two areas, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, are. Okay, so let's have a look at the brain from the side, and this is what's nice about these two areas. They are very much so visible when you just view the brain from the side. Okay, so all you have to do is remove the skull, okay, and then look at the brain from the side, and you can find Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So let me show this on a picture. Okay, so I'm drawing a picture that I hope everyone viewing this will be familiar with. Okay, so here is what the cerebral hemispheres look like if you view them from the left-hand side. So we're viewing someone's left hemisphere here. Okay, and then poking out from underneath, what you'll have is the beginnings of the brainstem, okay, or the lower parts of the brainstem. So you'll have the pons, and then the medulla here, going into the spinal cord below, like so. Okay, and then we'll have the cerebellum down here. Okay, now we'll be talking much more about the brainstem and other portions of the brain much later, but I'll just make sure that I label these up because this will save us time later. So here, the mini brain, this is the cerebellum here. Okay, so we'll colour that in orange. We're not going to really see the cerebellum at all in this video. It's very important in the motor system, okay, but isn't too important in schizophrenia. Okay, so that's the cerebellum. Okay, then you have the spinal cord down here in blue. Okay, so this is the spinal cord, and obviously the spinal cord will be much longer than I've shown it here. I've only shown the beginning of the spinal cord, but it will go on and on. Okay, then we've got the first portion of the brainstem here in red. Okay, and that first portion of the brainstem, which is located within the skull, okay, so this is the point where you enter the skull at the base. Okay, this is known as the medulla. Okay, and then above the medulla, which I'll colour in vivid purple here, which is disappearing because it's going into the base of the brain now. Okay, this is the pons. Okay, now that's just a little bit of neuroanatomy. Where is Broca's area and Wernicke's area? Okay, so let's look at the side of the cerebral hemisphere here. So one of the first landmarks that's on the side of the cerebral hemisphere is a crease down the brain, okay, so where the cerebral cortex invaginates inwards, okay, and this crease is very distinguishable. It's known as the central sulcus. Okay, right, now the portion of cerebral cortex directly in front of the central sulcus, this portion here, which I'll colour in red, okay, this is known as the primary motor area, and you might wonder, why is he telling me this? Well, I'm going to tell you where Broca's area is in terms of the primary motor area, and actually talking about the primary motor area is actually very important when we're talking about Broca's area, and I'll explain that in a moment. Okay, and it's not just because of neuroanatomy, okay, it's also functional. So this is called M1 for short. Its full name is the primary motor cortex. Okay, so the M is for motor, and then 1 indicates that it's the primary motor cortex. Okay, right, now, sitting in front of the primary motor cortex, you have the secondary motor cortex here. Okay, and the secondary motor cortex is divided into two separate portions. Okay, so this portion right at the top here, this is what's known as the supplementary motor area, and I'm running out of space, so I'm going to write supplementary motor area over here. Okay, so the supplementary motor area. Okay, and for short, the supplementary motor area is often abbreviated to the SMA for short. Okay, so I'll underline that in green so that it's all colour-coded. Right, and then that other portion of secondary motor cortex that's below the supplementary motor area in orange here, okay, this is the premotor cortex. Okay, so this is another portion of secondary motor cortex. Okay, now let me explain what secondary motor cortex and what primary motor cortex does, okay, because this will be actually very helpful in understanding what Broca's area is going to do when I show you Broca's area. Okay, so basically, the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex, the secondary motor areas, okay, these are responsible for coming up with what are known as motor plans. Okay, so let me explain what a motor plan is. So basically, if you want to perform a movement, if let's say you want to pick up a cup, okay, that requires you to contract a lot of muscles, and it requires them all to be contracted to the exact right amount, okay, at the exact right time, okay. It is an incredible feat, in fact, if you think about the elaborate arrangement of action potentials that you have to send down so many different nerves, okay. It's a real feat, okay. That combination of action potentials that you have to send down loads of different neurons, okay, at loads of different times, that is what is meant by a motor plan, okay. So it's a combination of action potentials that are being initiated in loads of different neurons, and also over a time period, okay, so you might have to produce multiple action potentials down certain neurons at certain times. That elaborate combination of action potentials that you have to produce that will be sent down and will cause this movement, that's what is meant by a motor plan. Okay, so basically, it's believed that the secondary motor cortex areas, which are the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex, it's believed that those come up with the elaborate combination of action potentials that you need. Okay, they then send this motor plan, okay, they stimulate the primary motor cortex, and then the primary motor cortex contains neurons which send their axons right down the spinal cord, and those axon terminals then synapse on the motor neurons themselves, okay, which will then leave the spinal cord and go to the periphery to stimulate the muscles, okay. So that's how the motor system works then. The secondary motor areas come up with the motor plan, which they send to the primary motor area, which then just relays it down to the motor neurons in the spinal cord, which then send it to the muscle cells. Okay, right, and then you initiate that movement. Okay, now, Broca's area then. Broca's area is down here, okay, underneath the premotor cortex there. So in blue here, this is Broca's area. Now, what is Broca's area responsible for doing? Well, it does a very similar thing to the secondary motor areas, okay? It is involved in creating motor plans. It's involved in creating combinations of action potentials. Now, what are these combinations of action potentials for? Well, they are for speech, okay? So if you want to say something, you have to have the muscles of your mouth, okay, and also of your vocal box, of your larynx, moving, okay, in an incredible collaboration, basically, okay. That requires a huge number of action potentials that are all coordinated. It requires an incredible combination of action potentials. What is generating this incredible, elaborate combination of action potentials that are going down loads of different neurons at loads of different times? It's Broca's area, basically. So Broca's area does the equivalent of the secondary motor cortexes, but for speech rather than for peripheral movement of muscles. Okay, and again, it will send the motor plan to areas in the primary motor cortex, which then relay it down to the muscles of the mouth and of the larynx. Okay, right, so Broca's area is involved in constructing motor plans for speech. Okay, so that's a little bit odd that that's activated in auditory hallucinations. That's a little bit of a puzzle still. Okay, Wernicke's area is the one that you'd be more expect to be active in auditory hallucinations. Okay, so perhaps I should have told you about Wernicke's area before Broca's area. This one is a little bit of a mystery. If you don't understand why Broca's area is active in auditory hallucinations, you're not alone. Okay, but it is. Okay, the one that's supposed to be creating sounds seems to be active, okay, when you're having auditory hallucinations. Okay, so now let me tell you about Wernicke's area. So, Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe here, so this little lobe here. The temporal lobe is split apart from the others by this fissure here, okay, which is a great invagination of the cerebral cortex inwards. Okay, and that fissure is known as the lateral fissure, so I'll just write that down. So, because it's on the lateral side of the brain, it's called the lateral fissure. Okay, right. I'll underline that in pink. So that's the lateral fissure there. Okay, right. Now, up here in the temporal lobe, okay, like so, is an area known as the primary auditory cortex. Okay, I'm going to colour this in yellow. Okay, and it's just smudged there horribly. Okay, now, for short, the primary auditory cortex is abbreviated as A1. Okay, so in the same spirit as the primary motor cortex is abbreviated to M1, the primary auditory cortex, which is responsible for audition, the sense of sound, okay, is abbreviated to A1. Okay, so this is the primary auditory cortex. So basically, all of the sensory information coming in from the auditory apparatus, so the inner ears, comes into the primary auditory cortexes. Okay, and of course you'll have one on each side of the body. Okay, one on each temporal lobe. Now, then what's going to happen is the information from the primary auditory cortex is going to be relayed to another area slightly further back than the primary auditory cortex up here in orange, and that is Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area then interprets the sounds that you are hearing, which so it interprets speech basically. So if you're hearing someone talking to you, this information firstly goes to the primary auditory cortex, and then the primary auditory cortex sends the information to Wernicke's area here, and Wernicke's area then turns that information into an actual meaning basically. So it gathers meaning from a series of noises basically. Okay, so it's involved in the interpretation of speech. So now that makes sense, okay, that Wernicke's area would be active in the auditory hallucinations. That makes absolute sense, because if I stimulated this, it would be as though the primary auditory cortex was sending information into Wernicke's area, and then Wernicke's area would interpret the speech. Okay, so if this is active even though this isn't, then of course you'll be hearing things even though there's nothing to actually hear. Okay, so that does make sense to explain the auditory hallucinations. Why Broca's area is active is a little bit more of a mystery. Okay, so that's what we know about what is happening when someone is actually having auditory hallucinations. Okay, right, we're now going to change tact completely. Okay, we're going to move to studying the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex instead of Broca's and Wernicke's area. Okay, so this was all about studying the auditory hallucinations. Now what we're going to talk about is discussing the cognitive symptoms. Okay, discussing what is understood of the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia. Okay, so one of the things that is found consistently in people with schizophrenia, okay, in post-mortem studies of their brains anyway, okay, is that they have thinner dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So you find a thinning of a portion of the cerebral cortex known as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which for short is abbreviated DLPFC, but I should write this out in full. So the DL stands for dorsolateral, okay, and then it's PFC stands for prefrontal cortex. Now I can show you very effectively where the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is on this picture that we've already drawn. Okay, so what colour shall I have it in? We'll have it in turquoise. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going to be coloured in turquoise. So prefrontal cortex suggests that it's very far near the front. Now, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex then is going to be found here. It's this sort of area here, in front of the secondary motor cortex, basically. Okay, so this area here is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, I just want to explain the origin of this word dorsal. Okay, so in the context of the brain, the word dorsal means a very different thing to what it would mean in the context of normal anatomy. Okay, so in the context of normal anatomy, dorsal means the same thing as posterior. Okay, so it means the back of your body. Okay, so something that is dorsal is right at the back of your body. Okay, the word ventral, okay, I'll write this down somewhere, ventral, in normal anatomy is then the same as anterior. It means towards the front of your body. In the context of the brain, the words ventral and dorsal mean something completely different. Okay, dorsal means towards the top of the brain. Okay, so dorsal means up here basically, and ventral means towards the bottom of the brain, so it means down here basically. Now you might say, well, why on earth is it like that? I think the reason that it is like that is because in embryology the brain originally sort of starts off completely erect. So imagine rotating this around 90 degrees. Okay, I think it originally starts off like that in embryology. Okay, so this really would be at the back, and this portion really would be at the front. Okay, and then later on, I think as the embryo grows, it sort of ends up being pulled round into this sort of flopped over shape. Okay, so I think that is the origin of this top of the brain being called dorsal and this bottom of the brain being called ventral. Okay, right, so that's important with understanding why this is dorsolateral, because you might think this is right near the front. Why on earth is it called dorsolateral? Okay, but as you can see, it's very high up, it's near the top of the brain, so that's why it's called dorso. Okay, and it's reasonably lateral, okay, so it's sort of facing out, so that's why it's called the dorsolateral. Okay, and then it's the prefrontal cortex. So, this area of the brain then, what is it involved in doing? Okay, well, its role is in working memory. Okay, so it's extremely important in working memory and also in executive control. So remember, working memory was the ability to either remember a string of numbers that you are presented visually, or remember a string of numbers that you're presented through auditory means. Okay. In addition, it's extremely important in executive control, which remember is the ability to make decisions about what you're going to do today. Okay, so executive control and working memory are the functions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, and we are saying that we find this area thinned in people with schizophrenia, so this could explain why you have deficits in working memory and also in executive control in schizophrenia. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, I want to tell you more about the nature of the thinning of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, because you might be thinking, well, what's happening to the cerebral cortex? Remember, the cerebral cortex is the place where all of the neurons have their cell bodies. Okay, so if it thins, you might be thinking, well, does that mean neurons in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are dying? Okay, now in the case of schizophrenia, it doesn't seem to be that neurons are actually dying. Okay, and to understand instead what is happening, you need to understand a little bit more about the cerebral cortex structure. Okay, so basically the main type of cell that you have in the cerebral cortex is a type of cell known as a pyramidal cell, okay, which I'm going to draw for you here, or a pyramidal neuron. Okay, and the reason that these cells are known as pyramidal cells are that their cell bodies appear in the shapes of triangles, basically, so in the shapes of pyramids. Okay, so here is the cell body of one of these pyramidal cells here. Okay, and these are very, very large cells. They have big cell bodies. Okay, and then they will send their axon down into the depths of the brain. So if this is the top of the cerebral cortex and this is the bottom of the cerebral cortex, they'll be sending their axons into the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres down here. Okay, now, the cerebral cortex does not quite only consist of cell bodies of pyramidal neurons, because the pyramidal neurons also have a huge number of dendrites, which end up looking like this when you actually see them on a histological slide. So actually a huge amount of the volume of the cerebral cortex isn't actually made up of these cell bodies of the pyramidal neurons. Instead, it's made up of all these dendrites of the pyramidal neurons. Okay, and these dendrites are collecting synaptic inputs from loads of different neurons. So these dendrites are going to be covered in other neurons coming in and synapsing on this pyramidal cell here. Okay, right. So what seems to happen in schizophrenia is that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex thins, and the reason it thins is that the number of dendrites that each of the pyramidal cells has goes down. Okay, so these dendrites, you lose loads of them. Okay, now that makes up a huge amount of the volume of the cerebral cortex as well. Okay, so that is why the volume of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex goes down, because the number of dendrites is going down. Now, why does the number of dendrites go down? Well, there is a potential explanation for why the number of dendrites is going down in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, so what we have found is that another area of the brain is also found to shrink in schizophrenia. Okay, so let me now talk about this other area of the brain. So it's one of the thalamic nuclei. Okay, so now we're going to have to discuss the brainstem anatomy in a little bit more detail, because I need to show you where the thalami are. Okay, so if we go back to my original picture of the brain here, because I'm not assuming that you know any neuroanatomy coming into this video, okay, what we're now going to do is we're going to work our way up the brainstem. Okay, so at the moment the brainstem is this portion poking out from the bottom of the brain. Okay, now you have one brainstem, it's right in the middle. Okay, what we're going to do is remove the cerebral hemispheres and we're going to just show the brainstem. Okay, and we're going to be able to show the portions that are buried deep within the cerebral hemispheres by doing this. So we're now going to work our way up the brainstem then. Okay, right. So we'll start off then with the spinal cord down here. Okay, so this is the spinal cord. Then above the spinal cord, what you then have is the medulla here. Okay, that was the first portion of the brainstem. Then you have the pons above the medulla. Okay, and then above the pons, which we couldn't see before because it was completely hidden within the depths of the cerebral hemispheres, is a structure known as the midbrain. Okay, so I'll put this here. Okay, like so. Now let's colour in what we've got here before we go any further. Okay, so we'll have the spinal cord then in green here. Okay, we'll have the medulla here in blue. Okay, we'll have the pons here in vivid purple. Okay, and then above the pons, we'll then have the midbrain here in red. Okay, so let's now label all of these things up. So here we have the midbrain of the brainstem. Okay, here we have the pons. Okay, here we have the medulla, and here the spinal cord. Now, sitting on top of the midbrain of the brainstem, we then have the thalami. Okay, now there is not just one thalamus. Okay, this is a common misconception. Okay, people think that we only have one thalamus. In fact, we have two thalami. Okay, you have a left thalamus and a right thalamus. Okay, so we are looking at the brainstem from the left-hand side. Okay, so we will be seeing the left thalamus perched on top of the midbrain here. Okay, so this structure here, this egg-like structure that is sitting on top of the midbrain, and you've got two of them, one perched on either side of the midbrain. Okay, a left thalamus perched on the left side of the midbrain, and a right thalamus perched on top of the right side of the midbrain. These are the thalami. Okay, so here we are seeing the left thalamus. And it's this structure that we now want to study, because a specific nucleus within the thalami is also going to degenerate in schizophrenia. Okay, and potentially this degeneration of this nucleus within the thalamus could also explain the loss of dendrites in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, now to go any further, what we're going to do is we're going to go from drawing a picture that looks at the brainstem from side on, like so, okay, and we're going to go over to looking at a picture that looks down from above, okay, instead. Okay, so we'll start by drawing what the midbrain looks like when you look at it from above, and then we'll show the two thalami perched on top of the midbrain. Okay, right. So let's start by drawing the midbrain here. So the midbrain is often compared to Mickey Mouse when you look at it from above like this. And it really does look like Mickey Mouse when you see it on a MRI scan. Okay, so here is the midbrain. Okay, so you have these peduncles on either side, which look like the ears of Mickey Mouse. Okay,